Welcome to the Clinical Trial Diversification Better Practices Training Session, Topic 5, Informed Consent Short Form. Clinical trial populations are often not reflective of the target populations who will use the medicine. Drug safety and efficacy can vary across demographic subgroups. Minorities have historically been underrepresented in clinical trial populations. Addressing the lack of diversity in clinical trials is an ongoing challenge for sponsors. But now the status quo is being challenged. Racial, ethnic subgroup populations are growing and will no longer be a minority soon. Marketing approvals are expected to become more stringent as regulatory authorities request more representative trial populations. Patients, physicians, and payers are increasingly demanding evidence of subgroup health outcomes. The drive towards personalized medicine will likely require sponsors to be more expansive in their recruitment practices. So we set out to answer this key question. How can sponsors improve racial and ethnic diversity in clinical trial populations to better reflect the targeted population? And one of our recommendations is that through this initiative, we recommend that sponsors consider the use of the informed consent short form and encourage sites to do the same in order to increase recruitment and retention of patients with low health literacy and/or limited English proficiency. As I said, sponsors face increasing pressure to ensure clinical trial populations reflect a disease state. These changing pressures come from several sources. There are regulatory and political pressures, where ensuring trial populations are representative of the indicated population. There are also scientific pressures, where the standard practice of generalizing scientific conclusions is challenged by the demand for personalized medicine. There are commercial demands as well. In the U.S., traditional minority populations are growing rapidly and expected to soon become the majority. There is also a social responsibility to act, broad recognition of the need to develop drugs with all patients in mind. There are several FDA guidance on these topics, and we will continue to adapt to the changing regulatory environment. So our objectives and our target audience include sponsor companies and tools that we will provide tools to increase clinical trial participation for patients with limited English proficiency and low health literacy and numeracy. The content provided in this presentation is intended for sponsor company resources responsible for supporting trial operations and/or overseeing site selection and feasibility, site training, patient enrollment, and informed consent form use and development, including clinical operations, site monitors, and any persons responsible for improving trial diversity. So as already noted, we need to change according to the changing population. As you can see, according to the 2010 U.S. Census, there will be a shift over the upcoming years in white versus non-white in the United States. In fact, by 2020, minorities are projected to account for over 40% of the nation's population. And by 2050, Hispanics will make up to 29% of the U.S. population. So faced with this changing population, we also see that the use of non-English languages is expected to continue growing in the U.S. And as you can see on this slide, that the number of Hispanic Spanish speakers in the U.S. will increasingly grow over the upcoming years. So what can we do? Our efforts to build clinical trial diversity must address the needs of patients with limited English proficiency and or low health literacy. So as you can see by this heat map, each dot represents 100 Spanish people who speak English less than very well. In 2010, 25.2 million U.S. residents spoke English less than very well. Limited health literacy affects adults in all racial and ethnic subgroups. Over 50% of U.S. adults have basic or below basic quantitative literacy and are challenged by numerical presentations of health, risk, and benefit data. So the consent form, generally speaking, is lengthy and complex, and is often associated with lower clinical trial retention rates. Therefore, the short form, accompanied by a presentation, may offer a more patient-friendly option for obtaining consent, especially if a subject or the subject's legally authorized representative is unable to read or understand English, or is unable to read due to illiteracy or blindness, or has low literacy and or numeracy. In those cases, then use of the short form should be considered. The reasons are because information contained in the consent long form must be orally presented with assistance from an interpreter if needed in the same quantity and quality in person or via video recording. The presentation must be witnessed by an impartial person, not otherwise connected with the clinical investigation. The short form should be signed after the presentation. The subject is then provided with a translated copy of the written summary, which is usually the long consent form, and a copy of the short form. The witness must sign both the short form and the written summary. Person obtaining consent must also sign the written summary. For patients with limited English proficiency, there are cases where different processes should be considered when languages are anticipated versus unexpected. So when a site expects a patient that speaks a specific language to enroll in the trial, translated informed consent forms can be IRB approved and readily available. Either long form or short form with written summary can be translated prior to study initiation. Investigators should provide IRBs with a description of how interpreters will be made available during the consent process. And during site feasibility and selection, sponsors may proactively request translation needs. But there are cases when there are unexpected language needs. In those cases, non-English speaking patient identified as eligible, but you do not have IRB approved translations of the long form or short form with a written summary available. So the options would be to assess the enrollment period and have the patient return at a later date once the forms are translated and approved. Or you can use an IRB-approved generic short form that had already been translated into multiple languages. PIs must consult with their IRB to determine there is sufficient justification for not waiting for a translated long form to be approved by the IRB. Further, for patients with limited English proficiency, the short form procedure for obtaining and documenting informed consent when the language is unexpected, there are several stepwise processes recommended by the FDA. Determine if there is sufficient justification to consent patients without a translated long form. In that case, investigator and IRB determine criteria to justify when to consent patients without waiting for the translated long form. The investigator then considers each circumstance and whether the consent process will provide sufficient information for the patient to make an informed decision. The next step is to obtain and document the subject's informed consent. And as a prerequisite, the translated IRB-approved generic form must be available in a language that is understandable to the patient. Then the PI, with the assistance of an interpreter, if needed, provides an oral presentation of information in the consent long form. An impartial third-party witness must be present who is fluent in the oral presentation language. The patient then signs and dates the short form and is given the IRB-approved translated short form and a copy of the IRB-approved English version of the long form, which is considered the written summary. The last step is that after the patient has been enrolled, the investigator must notify the IRB of enrollment if the IRB had not been previously notified. The PI must promptly obtain translated copy of an IRB-approved English version of the long form, then promptly submit it to the IRB for review and approval. This translated long form should be provided to the subject as quickly as possible. So the sponsor, the clinical investigator, and IRB should consider whether there are modifications needed to informed consent process to ensure that the informed consent is understandable. And this is specifically for patients with low literacy and numeracy skills. So the elements of informed consent may be presented to the subject or the subject's legally authorized representative. When doing so, the IRB may want to consider approving the use of the short form and written summary. The presentation must also be witnessed, and the witness signature entered in the informed consent form. The subject or legally authorized representative must sign the informed consent form. For subjects who cannot write, they may mark the ICF where allowed by law. The investigator is to document the reason for their mark versus the signature in each subject's chart. So a summary of differences between the short and long form are shown here. On the left, you'll see that the short form is generally 2 to 3 pages. Translated versions only need to be prepared once with generic content. It's easier for the subject to comprehend, and it may actually enable non-English speaking patients to be enrolled in trials just as quickly as English-speaking patients. On the right side of the screen, the table describes the long form of the consent form. Although the length can vary, it's often over 20 pages long, and it contains general and study-specific content. The versions need to be created for each study and each language. There is often complex language included, and there is usually high numeracy, especially when risks are being described. The table at the bottom of the screen is a short summary of the signatures and the provision of documents for each role involved in the informed consent process. The investigator, the subject, and the witness have varied responsibilities and require various documents to be provided. So sponsors should consider that once there is a pre-translated generic form approved by the IRB or site, that form can be used across studies. Study teams should assess what languages are spoken by those likely to be enrolled at a particular site. Sites should be encouraged to secure appropriate interpreter services in the anticipated language and be available through the course of the research. Witnesses should be fluent in the language of the oral presentation. Interpreters may act in the role of witness. Translations must be provided by qualified translators, and certifications are recommended. Sponsors will need to ensure funds for site interpreter services and, if applicable, production of video materials. Sponsors may discuss informed consent process for non-English speaking patients and those potential subjects with low health literacy or numeracy. Clear documentation of the process should be in place prior to site initiation, and sponsors can assist sites with developing their standard process. In closing, many IRBs already have available short form templates that are pre-translated in multiple languages. We have provided the following template as an example of a short form that may be adapted by sponsor organizations. Last, this includes Topic 5. For your use, you will find additional materials that could support your needs. Thank you.